Today's shiur begins at the beginning of the new parak on Daf Tes Zayin, the third parak Mi She'omar of Maseches Nazir. We have a Mishnah that you'll notice is rather long. It goes till the second line from the bottom. The first half of the Mishnah is material that basically has been dealt with already in the previous dapim of our Masechta. The Gemara that appears right after the Mishnah, a very short piece of Gemara, will be focusing on the second half of the Mishnah. On the side of the Gemara, you'll notice we have written under the nosei, the topic heading, the following: Zmane Tispores L'Nazirim Shonim. The different times, day-wise, for haircuts for different cases of Nazirus. A double underlining will be used to highlight the expression Mi Shenozar Shtei Naziros. Now the Mishnah, bearing in mind that the first half of the Mishnah should appear rather familiar. Mi She'omar Hareini Nazir, a person who accepts upon himself Nazirus, Megaleach Yoim Shloishim V'echad. Optimally, his haircut would be on day 31. In other words, there are 30 full days of wine abstention, and the haircut that is necessary at the end of the Nazir's period would be on the day after day 30, namely day 31. V'im gilach l'yoim shloishim yotza, and if he happened to take the haircut on day 30, he has fulfilled his requirements. We glance at Rashi for really review purposes. Rashi says, Misha Omar Hareini Nazir Megalech Yom Shloshim Ve'echad L'Rav Matana Kidi Islay, according to Rav Matana and his explanation, and later we notice Bar Kapora and his explanation. So Rav Matana Kidi Islay the Nazirus Stam Koi, according to Rav Matana, this acceptance of Nazirus is an unqualified Nazirus. He says, I will be a Nazir, not stating how much time. V'ein Nazirus pochs mishloshim yom, and you don't have a Nazirus less than 30 days. So the opening of the Mishnah says he will take the haircut on day 31. We're dealing with someone who accepted upon himself Nazirus. That means 30 days, according to Rav Matana, and hence the haircut on the day after the completion of the 30-day period. Ula Bar Kapora Kid Islay, Bar Kapora, he happens to hold that an unqualified Nazirus vow is 29 days. So how do you get to this opening of the Mishnah that says the haircut will be on day 31 if the basic Nazirus is 29 days? So Rashi reminds us, as we've learned in the past, the Muki law, Dinase Ka'omer Shleimim. It's viewed as if he said, I am going to be a Nazir for 30 full days. And all this entire section of the Mishnah has already been dealt with in the first parak of our Masechta. We continue in the Mishnah. Hareini Nazir Shloishim Yoim. Person says he will be a Nazir for 30 days. Here he's stating explicitly 30 days. Im gilach liyom shloshim lo yotz. If he takes his haircut on day 30, so he is not in fulfillment of his vow. Here you have a situation where, having stipulated, I will be a Nazir for 30 days, he's saying, in effect, for 30 full days. There's no flexibility here, and the haircut must be on day 31 and not prior to that. Misha Nazar Shtei Naziros. Person accepted 2 Naziros vows. Megalech es harishona yom shloshim ve'echad. The first haircut is on day 31. In other words, the first Nazirus was 30 days, and the haircut is on day 31. Ves hashniya Yoim Shishim Vechad, and the haircut for the second Nazirus will be on day 61. V'im Gilach es Rishona Yoim Shloshim, if he happens to take the haircut for the first Nazirus on day 30, Megalech es Hashniya Yoim Shishim. So the second Nazirus culminates with the haircut on day 60. V'im Gilach Yoim Shishim Choser Echad Yotza. If he ends up taking the haircut of the second Nazirus period on day 59, he is in fulfillment of his requirements. V'zu edus hayid Rabbi Papias al mi shenozer shtei naziros, and this is testimony that Rav Papias offers regarding someone who accepts 2 naziros. She'im gilach es rishona yom shloshim, if he takes the haircut for the first one on day 30, megaleach es hashniya yoim shishim, he can take the haircut for the second one on day 60. V'im gilach liyoim shishim choser echad, and if he takes the haircut for the second one on day 59, yotza, he is in fulfillment. So you'll ask, how in the world can a haircut on day 59 be in fulfillment when a nazirus is in effect 30 days? And we would say 30 plus 30 is 60. So the answer to that is Shiyom Shloshim Oileloi Min Haminyan. Day 30 can count not only as the culmination of the first Nazirus period, but it also counts, day 30 counts as day 1 of the second Nazirus period. And if you do your counting, starting with that particular day, day 30, counting it as day 1, so you'll find that 30 days ahead culminates on day 59. As we indicated earlier, till this point, the Gemara will not really elaborate on that. We've dealt with it in the past. We continue. On the side of the Gemara, we have an Osei topic heading, Dine mi shenitma besof naziruso. Laws regarding someone who became Tameh, defiled to the dead at the end of his Nazirus. The Mishnah. Misha Amar Hareini Nazir. If a person accepted upon himself a Nazir vow, Nitma Yoim Shloshim Soser Sakol, if he becomes defiled to the dead on day 30, he loses everything that he counted till that point, and he has to restart his Nazirus. Rabbi Lezer Omer Eino Soser Elo Shiva. He only loses 7 days, which really means he doesn't lose anything, but he has to wait 7 more days until he can bring the sacrifices in a state of ritual purity. In other words, to achieve ritual purity after having been defiled to the dead, one would have to wait 7 days. And there are more details to that, but for our purposes, we're dealing with numbers. Hareini Nazir Shloshim Yom. Here, someone accepts upon himself in an explicit fashion Nazirus for 30 days. Nitmo Yom Shloshim Soiser Esakol. If he becomes defiled on day 30, as far as we're concerned, day 30 is in the middle of his Nazirus because he accepted 30 complete days. He then loses everything. Hareini Nazir Mea Yom. Person accepts upon himself a long-term Nazirus for 100 days. Nitmo Yomea Soser Esakol. Defilement on day 100 results in your having to start all over again. Soser Esakol, you lose everything till that point. Rebbe Lezer Omer Eino Soser Elo Shloshim. Rebbe Lezer says that you lose only 30. In other words, you have to make up 30 more days, and then you have fulfilled your requirements. Nitmo yoim me'avi echad. If a person became Tomei on day 101, soiser shloishim yom. You lose 30 days. Now, that's an interesting point. When you've seemingly completed your Nazir counting, you became Tomei basically on haircut day. So you have to wait another 30 days. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Eino Soser Elo Shiva. You lose only 7 days. But as we indicated earlier, this latter part of the Mishnah will be explained a little further through this short piece of Gemara. The Gemara quotes the Mishnah. If you want to find where the quote comes from, use the arrow that you see to the immediate left-hand side of the Gemara text. Misha Omar Hareini Nazir. Person accepts upon himself Nazirus without qualifying how much time, and as we've said already many times, that's assumed to be a 30-day period. V'nitma yoim shloshim, and he becomes Tameh on day 30. Soser Esakol, he loses everything and he has to start all over again. Rabbi Lezer Omer Eino Soser Elo Shiva. He loses only 7 days, and that isn't in order to make up Nazirus days. Rather, it is in order for him to be able to bring his sacrifice in a state of ritual purity, which, as we said earlier, means that you have to wait 7 days from the point you became defiled. Because the Gemara continues at the top of Amud Beis, Kosovar Rebbe Eliezer. Rebbe Eliezer is of the opinion, Kol Achar Malois, any Tumah that is after you completed the 30 days, so Shiva Soser. It results in your losing 7 days. You might be asking, how is Tumah on the 30th day considered Achar Malos? Achar Malos means after you completed. How do you have on day 30 something that's called completion? So Rashi once again reminds us of information we learned in the first parak. This is dependent on how you explain this Tanaic opinion. Bar Pada holds that this Tana, Rebbe Eliezer, is of the opinion that Nazirus is basically 29 days. Well, if Nazirus is 29 days, so day 30 represents the day after you've completed your requirements. The other Amoraic explanation, that of Rav Matana, he holds Mitzas Hayom Kekulo. Part of the day is considered like an entire day. So, on day 30, part of it counts toward the completion of the 30-day Nazirus requirement. The other part of the day, the part after your defilement in this instance, represents Achar Malos, after you have completed. So from the point that you became defiled, that is already after the first part of the day. We continue once again with a quote from the Mishnah, and we have markings to help you find where this is. You have a little star. In this case, to the left-hand side of the Gemara text, you can align this with a corresponding star on Amud Aleph. Hareini Nazir Shloshim Yoim V'nitma Yoim Shloshim Soisers Hakol. A person who had accepted Nazirus for 30 days. Here he specified 30 days, and he became Tomei on day 30. So he has to make up the entire 30 days. Velo Polig Rebbe Ozer. The Tana Rebbe Ozer here does not argue. Why? The Omar Shleiman, here he said, I want to be a Nazir for 30 complete days. So day 30 is still within the counting. And hence, he, upon becoming defiled, must start all over again. Again, a quote from the Mishnah: Hareini Nazir Mea Yoim V'nitma Yoim Mea Soiser Es Hakol Rebbe Eliezer Omer Eino Soser Elo Shloshim V'Kula Kidahavinon Bo Aliba Debar Pada V'Rav Matona. And here the Gemara adopts shorthand and says all of this, the way to explain the Mishnah is what we have already explained in the past. Each one according to his opinion, Bar Pada according to his explanation, and Rav Matana according to his explanation. We glance at the Rashi. Rebbe Eliezer Omer Lo Soser Elo Shloshim Kidomer Reish Lakish Beperek Kamo. The time of Rebbe Eliezer Mishum Dekoma Kro Zois Teras Hanazir Biyom Melos. Reish Lakish explained this already in the first parak. The pasuk says this is the rule of the Nazir Biyom Melos. HaTorah Omra, the Torah says. Once again, we're explaining the Tana Rebbe Eliezer. The Torah says Nitma Biyom Melos. If you become tamei on the day of completion, Tain Lo Toras Nazir. You then apply to him the length of time of a basic Nazir. V'afilu b'Nazirus Meruba. Even if his original Nazirus vow was a long one, basic Nazirus is 30 days. So becoming Tamei on the day of completion of a long Nazirus results in your having to make up Toras Nazir only 30 more days. The Mishnah. Mi shenozar v'hu beveis hakvoros. A person accepted Nazirus, strangely enough, while in a cemetery. In other words, he is accepting Nazirus in a state of tumah, in a state of defilement. And when we speak about defilement with regard to a Nazir, it's limited to the defilement to the dead. So he has accepted upon himself Nazirus while in a state of tumas meis. Afilu hoya sham shloishim yoim, even if he remains there for 30 days, ein oilin loy min haminyan. Those days do not count toward his Nazirus requirement. V'eno mevi korban tuma. He does not bring a sacrifice or the series of sacrifices that a Nazir who became defiled would ordinarily have to bring. Yotza v'nichnas, if this very person who had originally accepted Nazirus in a state of defilement, if he left the cemetery and he achieved Tara, in other words, the 7-day waiting period took place, during which there is the sprinkling of the ash water mixture from the red heifer, from the Poraduma, on day 3 and day 7 during that week of Tahara. And then he went back into the cemetery. Oilin loy min haminyan, umevi korban tuma. We take a look at the Rashi. The Rashi we're looking at, Dibor Masl Yotzov v'Nichnas, there's a amendation, the Nuschus HaRivan that you see on the side of the Gemara. He quotes a different text. He says, "V'kisvei yad isa b'zeh haloshen," and we're reading from the Nuschus HaRivan for the time being. Instead of reading the Rashi text itself, you notice, I hope everyone sees, so we can read along with the Rivan. So, Bekisvei Yad Isa B'zeh Haloshen, and Ois Dalid of the Rivan, Yotza v'nichnas, avol im Yotza v'huza v'shina v'toval. That means if he left the cemetery, have the huza is the sprinkling of the poraduma water, and on the 3rd day, and then repeated on the 7th day, v'toval, and immerse himself, miyad cholo olov. Immediately, the original vow that he had taken while in the cemetery takes hold. If after this he goes into the cemetery, those days that he had observed after achieving the Tara start counting toward his Nazirus. Mikivan shishona v'tava b'yoyim shvi shelo shemevi korban al hatuma, and that's the Hosov Dibor. In a case like that, so the Nazirus that he originally accepted would start ticking away after he achieves Tahara, and then if he becomes Tomei, he will have to bring the korban that a Nazir shenitma, a Nazir that becomes upon, has to bring. According to what we learned in the Rashi with this Nusach HaRivan, is that if on that very same day, on day 7, that he achieved Tara, he goes back into the cemetery, he then will have to bring the korban tuma, the korban for a Nazir that became Tomei. We continue in the Mishnah. Rabbi Ozer Omer lo bo bayom. He says, not so if on that very day that he achieved Tara, he went immediately back into the cemetery. The Mishnah quotes a pasuk, Shneimar vayomim harishonim yiplu. That in the context of the Nazir who became Tomei, the pasuk speaks in the plural in terms of days. He would have had to count 2 days. It says the first days fall. Until he has achieved multiple 2 days of Nazirus Betara and then becomes Tomei, only then would he bring the korban of a Nazir Tomei. Let's look at the Rashi together. Reb Lezer Omer Lobo Bayom Kishizo Vishino V'Toval Im Nichnas. If he had achieved Tara through Shina, V'Toval is the Hiza, V'Shina is the sprinkling on the 3rd day, Shina means repeated on the 7th day, and then immerse himself if he went then into the Beis HaKvoros, into the cemetery, Eino Mevi Korban Tuma, Achi Avarov Shnei Yomim, V'Yomi B'Shlishi, until 2 full days of Nazirus B'Tahara goes by, and then on the third day he goes into the Tumah. Shnamar vayomim rishonim yiplu. Emosai shemikure kol mikro zeh shiu lo yomim rishonim. Only when I can refer to him this pasuk that speaks about 2 days of tahara going by, then he becomes a subject to the rules of a Nazir who defiles himself and has to bring a sacrifice. So we have a machlokas tanoim concerning someone who had accepted Nazirus, originally in the state of Tumah, achieved the 7 days of Tara, and then on that last day, on day 7, he went back into the cemetery. It seems to me that even if on day 8 he went back into the cemetery, Rabbi Elazar still would say he is exempt. You'd have to have 2 full days of Tara in order for Rabbi Elazar to require him to bring the sacrifices of a Nazir Shenitma to begin with. On the side of the Gemara, we have a Nosei Klali and Mivneh heading. Nosei Klali means a general topic heading. The Mivneh, a structural note, and we indicate that this is until Daf Yud Ches Amud Aleph. So we have a rather long topic ahead of us. A double underline appears. This highlights the expression Misha Nazar Behu Beveis HaKvoros. You'll notice that we use this marking here, and on Daf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph, you'll notice at the lower part of the page, and on Daf Yud Zayin Amud Beis, you'll notice 4 lines from the top. Again, this double underlining. So you can see how we're getting maximum use out of our double underlining. You can see, the bird's eye view of this long sugya. The topic heading that we have for the immediate sugya is Machloikis Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, a controversy between these 2 Amoroyim, B'misha Nazar V'hu B'veis HaKvoros, someone who accepted Nazirus while in a cemetery. Ha'im HaNazirus Chola Olav Oy Loi. Does the Nazirus take hold at all? Is there any vow that is present, or maybe it's one big zero? After we present the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, you'll notice triangles appear, and they represent kushos al Reish Lakish. So the triangles that appear are, as we say, questions on Reish Lakish, and you'll notice how if you turn to Yud Zayin Amud Aleph, the triangle's scheme continues basically all the way down most of Yud Zayin Amud Aleph. So Reish Lakish is going to be subjected to quite a bit of questioning. When you get to Yud Zayin Amud Aleph, by the way, you'll notice a slight change in the type of triangles that are used, because there is a change in the sugya regarding what Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are arguing about. So there's going to be a restatement of their machloikes, and even after that restatement of their machloikes, questions continue on Reish Lakish. Now, we haven't said what he holds, but that's the derech of Gemara markings, where even if you don't know the information, at least you have a course of travel mapped out. Now the Gemara, Itmar, Misha Nazar Behu Beveis HaKvoros. Someone accepted upon himself Nazirus, and he is standing in a cemetery. Rabbi Yochanan Omar, Nazirus Chola Olav. Rabbi Yochanan says, the Nazirus vow starts, it takes hold. Reish Lakish Omar, Ein Nazirus Chola Olav. And Reish Lakish disagrees. Before going further, let's glance at the Rashi. There's a Rashi in the lower part of the narrow lines. Itmar, Misha Nazar Beis HaKvoros, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Nazirus Chola Olav. To Kosovar, he holds the high man, the Mekabel Nazirus Beis HaKvoros, one who accepts a Nazirus vow in the cemetery, and Rashi quotes that which we'll see shortly in the Gemara itself. What does he hold? Mitlo Talya V'Kaimo. It's in suspension. In other words, there's something there, but it's suspended. That's Mitlo Talya V'Kaimo. V'Kevon de Mishkachas Tara, and once Tara is achieved, once purification is achieved, Dahainu Lachar Shiyetze, V'Hizo V'Shana, V'Toval, And when is purification, when is Tara achieved? Well, after he leaves the cemetery, has the double sprinkling, 3rd and 7th day, and immersion, Chayla Oleh, the Nazir's vow then takes hold. And here's the main point. This takes hold even if he doesn't say a word about his original vow. He doesn't say, I'm now accepting upon myself that which I originally had vowed in the cemetery. So even without saying that, it takes hold. That is what Rabbi Yochanan means when he says the Nazir's vow takes hold. It takes hold and it's in suspension. The Tosfos that you'll find the lower part of the page, 7 lines from the end, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Nazirus chol olav l'chol mili. For all purposes there is Nazirus v'lo kibay disham atuma im hisu b'lotzeis mimenu. He's even subject to lashing if, while he was there in the cemetery, he was warned, leave, and he doesn't leave. He is thereby subjected to malchus, to lashings, vatiglachas, and he's subject to punishment if he takes the forbidden haircut, vashtias yayin, and for drinking wine, ukshiyitar, ein sorch lachsu l'kabel of nazirus. And when he becomes purified, he doesn't have to re-accept nazirus. So according to the Tosfos explanation, the nazirus has basically full manifestation, even though while he accepts it, he is tomei. Let's continue in the Gemara. Now the Gemara makes the presentation of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Nazirus chola olav, the vow that he took while in the cemetery takes hold. Savar, Rabbi Yochanan holds mitla talia v'kaima. The Nazirus is in a state of suspension. Now, we said when we learned the Tosfos that all the rules of Nazirus apply. One thing that doesn't apply is that he doesn't get credit for the 30 days that are required for a Nazir to observe. So in that respect, we say, well, he is in suspension. Kevon de mishkecha Tara, when he finally meets up with Tara, when he achieves purification, Chayla, the Nazirus, takes hold even though he doesn't re-accept it. For Reish Lakish Amar ein Nazirus chol olav, Reish Lakish says that the vow to be a Nazir while in the cemetery does not take hold. The Hadar v'Omar Chayla v'lo loy. If he re-accepts the Nazirus, then he becomes a Nazir. Then Chayla, then it takes hold. And if he doesn't re-accept it, nothing happens. And we introduced earlier the triangles. We're going to be questioning Reish Lakish's position. Eisvei Rabbi Yochanan l'Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan asks, Misha Nazar v'hu b'veis hakvoros, someone who becomes a Nazir while in a cemetery. Afilu hoyasham shloishim yoyim, even if he is there 30 days. And of course this is a quote from our Mishnah, Ein oilin min haminyan. The 30 days that ensue from the point that he accepted the Nazirus while in the cemetery and he remains there, so they don't count toward his Nazirus 30-day requirement. The Eino Mevi Korban Tuma, and he doesn't bring the sacrifice that a Nazir Tomei would ordinarily bring for having defiled himself. And we now infer Korban Tuma Hu Delo Maisi. The only exemption is that he does not bring that series of sacrifices for as a Nazir Tomei would ordinarily bring. However, the basic Nazirus does take hold. The Tosfos second from the bottom says, Korban Tumahu Delo Maisi Demarate Kra Lekamon. There's a scriptural limitation excluding the bringing of a sacrifice for Tuma under these circumstances. But that's a scriptural exclusion. But as far as everything else is concerned, the Nazirus does take hold regarding lashing for the Tumah, for taking a haircut, for drinking wine. Reish Lakish responds, Amalei Eino b'toiras tuma v'eino b'toiras korban. When the Mishnah says Eino mevi korban tuma, Reish Lakish understands that to mean he is simply excluded from all the rules of tuma and all the rules of korbanos. Total exclusion. Eisvei, again a challenge to Reish Lakish. Mishaya tomei v'nozar, someone who had been tomei and while in a state of tuma accepted the Nazirus vow. He is not allowed to take a haircut, drink wine, nor defile himself to the dead. If he did any of those, he is subjected to the lashing penalty. The 40, technically speaking, it's 39 lashings for having violated the Nazirus. If you say, like Rabbi Yochanan, that someone, while in a state of defilement, vows to be a Nazir, it takes hold. I understand, therefore, why he is liable and subject to the lashing penalty. If you're going to take Reish Lakish's position that a Tomei individual that vows to be a Nazir, nothing takes hold, why should he be subject to lashing? He hasn't become a Nazir whatsoever. The Gemara continues at the top of Daf Yud Zayin. Hacha b'mai askinon b'yotzei v'nichnas. This source is actually talking about someone who, after he had become Tomei, he left his state of Tumah, he achieved Tara, and then became Tomei again. Let's take a look at the Rashi at the top of Daf Yud Zayin. Hacha b'mayaskinon b'yotzei v'nichnas shiyotza. He left the Tumah, he left the cemetery. V'hiza b'shlishi shvi v'toval. And he had the Torah Aduma, ash, water sprinkling, thereby an immersion in the mikveh, thereby achieving real Tara. And now, notice what Rashi adds, V'hodar Omar, and then he said afterwards, Hareini Nazir, V'nichnas. He then reaccepted Nazirus, and went back into the Tumah, went back into the cemetery, Soifikas Arboyim. He is subject to the lashing. Now, you might ask, well then, isn't that all obvious? What's the purpose of teaching this? The purpose here is to the exclusion of the other Tanaic opinion, that of Rebbe Lezer, that if he goes back immediately on the day that he achieved Tara, he will not be subject to the Nazir punishments for defilement and the haircut and the wine. If, however, he doesn't say again the Nazir's vow, he's not going to be subject to any restrictions because the vow doesn't take hold automatically. We continue. Eisvei, the Gemara quotes again a Tanaic source. It says, Ein bein tomei shenozar lenozir tor shenitma. There is no difference between someone who already was tomei and then accepted Nazirus while in a state of defilement to someone who was tohor as a Nazir and then became defiled. Elo tomei shenozar shvi'i shaloi oile loi leminyan. A person who had accepted Nazirus while tomei, when he counts the 7 days of Tara that are required to exit the state of Tumah, that 7th day counts as day 1 for his Nazirus. This individual, as we've learned already, is not subject to bringing a sacrifice. So, day 7, he can already start his counting toward the new Nazirus. The Nazir Torah Shinitma, a person who was a Nazir, a proper Nazir, and then became defiled, he has to observe 7 clean days, 7 days outside of defilement, during which, as we've said already a number of times today, there's a paraduma water ash sprinkling on the 3rd and 7th days. This individual has to bring sacrifices because he was a Nazir Tohor that became defiled. When does he bring the sacrifices? Not on day 7, but rather the next day, on day 8. So as a result of that, Ein Shvi Shelo Eila Leminyan. His day 7 doesn't count toward the counting of the new Nazirus, or of the Nazirus Betara. He has to wait till day 8, which will count as the first day toward his Nazirus of Tahara. So that is the difference. If you are to think that a person who was in a state of Tumah, who accepted Nazirus, nothing takes hold, Amai Oila Loi Min Haminyan. Why then does day 7 count toward his Nazirus of 30 days? He hasn't become a Nazir at all. What do we mean that day 7 counts toward what? He's nothing. If you say, as Reish Lakish said, that nothing takes hold. Omar Mor Baravashi, Mechal Kuliamalo Pligi de Chayla. Here we have a big turnaround in the Gemara. Contrary to what we thought before, Mar Baravashi says, as far as something taking hold, the Nazir vow taking hold while he was already Tomei and vowed to be a Nazir, everyone agrees it takes hold. Something takes hold. Eloki pligi lemilki. The machloikis between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish is with regard to punishment, the lashing punishment. Before we go further in the Gemara, let's take a look at the Tosfos. You'll notice under the Gemara text, the first line of the Tosfos, it begins with the word Hago, Mechal de Kulialma de Chayal. Everyone agrees that something takes hold. Ukshitar ein tzorch lachzor lidor benozir. And when he achieves Tara, on that 7th day after having the Poraduma sprinkling and the immersion in the mikvah, he doesn't have to re-accept the Nazir vow that he originally took when he was in a state of Tumah. The Chayal Allah of Nazirus Rishon. It takes hold, it sets upon him from the original Nazirus vow. V'nicha hashta, and with this in mind, then it's understood the shvi oila loy minaminyan vafilu lo yachzor v'yikabel, that day 7 counts toward the new Nazirus period, even if he doesn't re-accept the vow. V'wadin nami demoida Reb Shimon ben Lakish the Laki toch yemei tumaso ashtia vatiglachas, and Reish Lakish will concede that if during the Tumah period, before he achieved Tara, he drinks wine or takes a haircut, he is subject to lashing. Because as we're saying now, everyone agrees that the Nazirus took hold. V'chi pligi lemilki, the Gemara said that there's a machlokus regarding lashings, pirush atuma lechud, lashing for defilement. That's the point of machlokus. Hisrubo atuma. If he was warned concerning the tumah, will he be subject to lashing? Rabbi Yochanan Savar given the Chayla Nazirus l'shar mili ashtiyasyan v'tiglachas chaylanami atuma im hisrubo lotzeis v'lo yotza. Since the Nazirus takes effect regarding the wine restriction and the haircut restriction, it takes effect also with regard to Tumah. If this person, while standing in the cemetery, who had accepted Nazirus, was warned, leave the cemetery, and he doesn't, he is subject also for that to lashing. The Torah, which makes an exclusion for the Nazir who was Tameh, excludes him only from the sacrifice requirement, but doesn't exclude him from the Malkus punishment for defilement. For Reb Shimon Reish Lakish accepts the position that even though the Nazirus takes hold with regard to the other matters, lo loki atuma, he will not be subject to lashing for the tumah. Since the Torah excludes him from the necessity of bringing sacrifices, he is excluded from all the laws that have pertinence to tumah, including exclusion from malchus. So we continue back in the Gemara. We've focused, courtesy of the Tosfos, the machlokas, to is there malchus for the tumah when he's warned to leave and doesn't. Rabbi Yochanan savar kiva dechayla loki, since the Nazirus takes hold, he's subject to malchus as well for tumah. Reish Lakish savar lo loki v'chayla. He does not subject himself to malchus, even though the Nazirus takes hold with regard to the wine and haircut restrictions. On the side, we have a mivneh, a structural. We already mentioned this earlier, but we look at it again inside. On the side of our Gemara, Hemshich Kushis al Reish Lakish, these triangles simply represent the continuation of challenges, questions on Reish Lakish. Hatam Shininu, the triangle. The reason we changed the triangle to this style, colored in tip, the Adkana Gemara Choshva Shecholkim Im Chola Nazir. Up till this point, the Gemara thought that the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish is the Nazir's chal at all? Does it take hold to begin with? Achshav Gemara Severis the Luchuliyama Chola Nazirus. At this point, everyone agrees that the Nazirus does take hold. V'cholkim Im Chayev Malchus, and the machlokes is simply whether there is a chiyuv malchus, and we saw in the Tosfos regarding the tumah. The Gemara, Eisvei Reb Yochanan l'Reish Lakish. Mi shenazar v'hu b'veis hakvaros afilu hu hoya sham shloshim yoyim ein oilu loy min haminyan ve'eino mevi korban tumah. This, of course, is a quote from the Mishnah. We saw it already a few times. Someone who accepted Nazirus while in the cemetery, even if it's there for 30 days, it doesn't count toward his minyan, toward his Nazirus, and he does not bring the korban sacrifice. Korban tumahu delo maisi, and now we infer the only thing he is excluded from is the need to bring the sacrifices that a Nazir who became Tomei would have to bring. Ha milka laki ole. However, for the tumah that he is exposed to now and warned to leave and doesn't, he is subject, or we can say he is subject to malchus. Just to repeat, the only thing he is excluded from is the need to bring a sacrifice. Nothing else, including the liability to receive malchus for remaining in the tumah. That's a problem for Reish Lakish, because Reish Lakish said there would be no malchus for remaining in the tumah. Reish Lakish would respond, "B'dinhu delisni eino loke." Technically, the Mishnah could have said he is not subject to lashing, "Elamishim dekaboi lemisna seifa." But since the seifa wanted to feature a tumah, a korban tumah requirement, so the Reisha said he's not liable to bringing the sacrifice. What does the seifa say? Yotza v'nichnas. The person who had been tomei, who if he leaves achieves tahara and then goes back, he does bring the korban for having defiled the Nazirus. Tana Reisha, in contrast, so the Reisha teaches Eino Mevi Korban Tumah. So simply for, we'll say, Tanaic stylistic considerations, the Reisha did not speak about the malchus exemption. But there is a malchus exemption. So as to justify Reish Lakish's position. Tashma. We continue with another question. Again, quoting from a source we saw on Daf Tezayin. Ein bein Nazir tomei shenazar leNazir Torah shenitma. There is no difference between someone who accepted Nazirus while tomei versus someone who was a Nazir Torah and became defiled. Ela shetomei shenazar shvi shelo yelo min haminyan. The tomei shenazar, the person who, while in a state of defilement, accepted Nazirus, so his 7th day of purification can count toward the new Nazirus period. The Nazir Torah shenitma ein shvi shelo yelo loy min haminyan. in his case, the Nazir Tomer that became Tomei, his 7th day of Tahara, of purification, does not count toward his new 30-day counting. He has to wait till the next day. So this Tanaic source points out the differences between them. Hala Malkis, Zev Zev Shavin, but regarding lashing, they're both the same. In other words, everyone knows that a Nazir Tohar, a person who was a Nazir and he was Tohar, and then became Tomei, if he deliberately became Tomei, so he's certainly subject to Malkis. That's accepted across the boards. So this source makes it clear that the Tomei Shenazar is the same. And hence we have a kasha on Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish wanted to say that the Tomei Shenazar is exempt from Malkis. This source doesn't indicate thusly. Omar le loy. Reish Lakish responds and says, not so. The source that says there is no distinction, leaving room, in other words, the source that said there is a distinction on this particular point, leaving room to infer that on some other point there is no distinction, it's as follows. L'tiglachas zev v'zeh shavin. With regard to the haircut prohibition, they are the same. But regarding Malkis for Tumah, they're not the same. Would maintain Reish Lakish. The Rashi, a few lines up from here, says, that both of them take the haircut on their 7th day. But as far as Malkis is concerned, they're not the same. The Gemara continues with a question. Avolin Malkis Mai. But with regard to Malkis, what do you want to say? Zeh loike v'zeh no loke. That the Nazir Tohar that became Tomei gets Malkis. The Tomei Shenazar does not get Malkis. That's what you, Reish Lakish, want to say? Listen, so teach it. That's something significant that should have been taught explicitly. Reish Lakish answers, Betakante komairi bekilkule lo komairi. This source was talking about takante, we'll say positive things. When does he start the recounting? That's what the object of this source was, to emphasize the positive things that need to be done. Kilkule, we'll call the mess up, the negative things is not what this source was interested in talking about. Let's take a look at the Tosfos commentary, in the lower part of the page, in the middle of the wide lines. Betakanto kamairi masa yaschil minyan l'naziruso v'unitma b'shogeg. What the source is interested in describing is when does he start counting toward the fulfillment of his Nazir's vow in the case of someone that became Tomei in a state of shogeg, in other words, unwittingly. With regard to someone who deliberately exposes himself to Tumah, Tahainu Kilkul Gufei, that's something where he himself, let's say, ruining himself. The Gam the Reish Lakish Ozer Litamos, even according to Reish Lakish, it's Ozer to expose oneself to the Tumah. Afilu Besoch Shiva, even within the 7 days. The Im Lokain, if not so, Lisni Zeh Muter Litamos V'zeh Ozer Litamos Taha Lav Kilkulahu. If it were so that someone who was a Tomei Shenazar doesn't have any Tumah restrictions, then even during the 7 counting days of purification where he hasn't achieved Tahara yet, it should have said that a Tomei Shenazar is allowed to expose himself to Tumah, and a Tahar Shenitma is not allowed. But it doesn't say that. That's because this source wasn't interested in talking about kilkul, let's say deliberate messing up. But as far as, we'll say, bottom line is concerned, as far as Reish Lakish is concerned, there is a distinction regarding Malkis for the Tumah as well. The Gemara continues. Ta Shma. Mi shehoya tomei v'nozar. Like someone who was standing in a cemetery and accepted Nazirus while standing in a state of tumah. Also, legalech v'lishtos yayin. He is prohibited from taking a haircut. He cannot drink wine. V'mgilach v'shosa yayin v'nitma l'mesim. If he took a haircut, drank wine, and defiled himself to the dead. Harezes soifeg es raboyim. So here you see someone who was in a state of tumah, and he was warned, leave the tumah, and he doesn't do so. He is subject to malchus. Tiyufta. This then represents a Tanaic refutation to Reish Lakish's position. With that, we conclude our shiur for today.